welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Daniel McAdams, who's become a regular guest on this show. And I like to have Daniel here because I believe that what he's doing at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, which he heads up, is very, very important work, and I think it's information that you just simply don't get on the mainstream, and of course that's what this show is all about. It's about trying to help you understand what's really going on as opposed to what the propaganda machine, the self-serving propaganda machine, is doing. You know, we talked a little earlier today about how Goldman Sachs was telling everybody to sell gold, and they were out there buying all they could get at the very time they were telling people to sell gold. Well, we have a lot of people that are telling us that we have to be scared about all these other countries around the world, and therefore we have to go to war and beat the hell out of them and kill them and take over their countries and insert our own governments, our own puppets there in order to make us safe here in America. Well, Ron Paul, of course, has believed the opposite is true, that we would be safer if we mind our own business, we trade with people, interact with them, be friendly with them, but don't go trying to tell them how to live their lives, how to change their societies, how to tell them their religions are wrong, how to tell them how to live. Ron has always believed that that the golden rule is kind of a good idea. If you want to get along with people, you might want to treat them the way you'd like to be treated. So Daniel McAdams heads up Ron Paul's Institute, and Daniel was with Ron Paul, was his foreign policy expert when Ron was a congressman, and so he stayed on with Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome, Daniel. Really good to have you with us again.
Thanks, Jay. It's always good to talk to you.
I'd like to have you on just to go over some of the articles at the Ron Paul Institute .org, ronpaulinstitute.org, and a couple of articles that you wrote. If we could talk about those first. One was Representative Mike Rogers threatens extrajudicial execution. My goodness, that sounds pretty severe. What's that all about?
It is, and it's I start out by talking about how we have an annual human rights report that our State Department writes about every other country in the world. We see ourselves as being fit to judge how other countries behave in terms of human rights. Mm-hmm. But one of the top categories for countries that don't respect human rights is whether they engage in extrajudicial executions, which means killing people without a trial.
Right.
Yeah. So which is a pretty good mark of a pretty nasty country. People that would do that.
Yes.
But,
we would never do that in America.
Well, there was a panel discussion this past week on cybersecurity where former NSA and CIA Chief Michael Hayden was there with the current chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers, who's a Republican from Michigan. When the talk moved to Eric Snowden, the NSA leaker, and the fact that he was on a list to receive a human rights award from Europe, Hayden made a little joke saying, he'd also thought of nominating Snowden for a list, but it was for a different list, ha ha ha, meaning the kill list.
Right.
It becomes less funny when you realize that he actually had the power at the time to do that. But without missing a beat, Chairman Rogers, who is one of the most pro-war neocons in the House, who himself comes from an intelligence background, he chimed in right away and said, "Oh, I can help you with that."
Oh, wow.
So it's, even if it was all meant to be jokey, these guys have the power to do that. And it's, not only is it not funny, for someone in a position of Rogers to make such a statement is just so outrageous and repulsive. How far we've fallen that we joke about things that we judge other countries being horrible dictatorships for.
Exactly right, and of course, I'd like to just remind our listeners once again that it wasn't made public on our airwaves by our major media, but Der Spiegel reported that a former president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, said that we no longer have a functioning, or we don't currently have a functioning democracy in the United States. Now, we're a country that went around, we got involved in World War I to make the world safe for democracy, and yet we don't even have one here, according to President Carter. Whatever you think of President Carter, the fact that a former sitting president of the United States would make such a statement, and the fact that the American media, of course, would not pick this up, says a lot about about the lack of truthfulness in our media. Wouldn't you say so, Daniel?
Sure, I think it does, and I think, President Carter, for his funny reputation years ago, has certainly made up for it in a lot of the efforts he's made toward real human rights. So people should listen when he says something like that. But I would think that we should be a little bit more encouraged, and I think he has a very good point to make. But I think the recent uproar over the president's desire to bomb Syria and the fact that so many Americans were opposed to it resulted in it not happening, or at least contributed to the decision to not do this, is perhaps a bit of good news in an otherwise sort of glum statement by the former president.
Yeah, for sure. Which maybe while we're on the note of optimism, I can just ask you about an article that Ron Paul wrote on the website, the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, titled "The Phone Call," and that had to do with the discussion. Ron has been an advocate of talking to your enemies before going to war, and of trying to avoid that if possible. I guess maybe you just pass along Ron's ideas and his thoughts in that article called "The Phone Call."
Well, I think it was cautious optimism with a bit of an emphasis on the cautiousness.
Sure.
He wrote, quote, "It's a good sign that the phone call has infuriated the neoconservatives back home, the pro-war faction in Israel, and the hardliners in Iran." Mm-hmm. So the fact that President Obama had a telephone conversation with the president of Iran, this is the first discussion between the two heads of state since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And as we know, Rouhani, the new president of Iran, is considered a moderate, and certainly his style of speaking is an enormous change since his predecessor. So the phone call, Dr. Paul believes, is a very positive sign. However, within the article is a serious warning that the neocons and the warmongers are not going to give up, whether they're here or in Iran or in Israel or elsewhere. So he cited a recent CNN poll that more than 75% of Americans favored negotiations with Iran. So that's a good sign. Most people are with the president on this. But, just as the president is having this phone call, you have several members of Congress. You probably know these names well, Jay. Lindsey Graham, notorious, and also Trent Franks from Arizona, who's a big neocon, introducing legislation to authorize the president to go to war with Iran, almost literally as he's on the phone. So they are not going to give up easily, and as a matter of fact, as Dr. Paul mentioned in his column, they're probably going to try to double the propaganda.
Well, I would guess so.
Yeah,
absolutely, and all the major networks will be out there. For the most part, they won't be listening to Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich on these issues. They'll be, although it's encouraging to have Ron coming on sometimes, and I saw him with Jay Leno recently and some other people. He is Bloomberg, and it's good. We have to keep trying, I think, Daniel. Okay,
Sure.
So speaking of neocons, another article that you wrote. NSA wolves in reformers' clothing. They're not going to go away. Talk to us about that, because what I think will happen is you'll have the liberals in the Democratic Party that will try to say, this was good, but man, we've got to be careful because these are dangerous people. These are dangerous countries out there. We've really got to remain tough.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
who are these NSA wolves in reformers' clothing that you're talking about?
Well, one of the points I make is that the two most dangerous things that you hear out of Washington is let's create a commission and let's reform something, because it both means that things are about to get worse, and with all of these revelations about the NSA spying on all of us instead of the bad guys, the real bad guys out there, the first thing Washington wants to do is to have a reform process. So where you have honest people like Senator Ron Wyden, who I think really does have our civil liberties in mind, is looking to do make some serious changes. The same is true with Justin Amash, representative from Michigan. Both of them have serious reforms, including simply cutting off the money, which is the best way to do it.
Right.
You have other people who jump on the reform bandwagon, like Senator Dianne Feinstein from California, who absolutely loves the NSA. She loves the surveillance state. And so she introduced a reform bill that actually gives more authority, more surveillance authority to the NSA. So it's reform, but it's reform going in the opposite direction.
But the impression that she would want to leave is that it's in a more humane, protective environment, right? I mean, she wouldn't want to...
I mean, in the House and indeed in all politics in the U.S., you have really the triumph of dialectical materialism.
Yeah.
So what Feinstein's reform seeks to do is to carve out, quote, middle ground between her and someone like Wyden and Amash, who actually do want to make things better. So, this is how it is with the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. You'll have Wyden on one end, and then Feinstein will come in, well, let's compromise and have my bill as a compromise. But what it does is it gives the NSA an enlarged window during which they can spy on people who arrive in the United States. So it actually gives them more power to spy here domestically on people.
So on the surface, the wine, these lawmakers can actually convince their people that they're on the side of liberty and less government intrusion, when in fact they're doing exactly the opposite.
Sure, and you have to, as usual, you have to read between the lines. So she has some language, some very cosmetic language in there that will have more reporting, which is absolutely useless. Yet another report. There'll be more reporting, and maybe they'll appoint a government-paid advocate for our privacy within the system, as if that will help. So they'll employ all this language, but when you really look between the lines, it's the opposite of reform.
Mm-hmm. Sheep in wolves' clothing, as they say, or NSA wolves in reformers' clothing, as you wrote in your article. That's two of the articles you wrote. There's another one. My engineer is saying we got a couple of minutes left. An article by Andrei Okolov, October 6th, that CIA activities in Syria stepped up aid to Islamists. So is the CIA sort of helping out the Islamists there, I guess, try to overthrow the government there?
Well, what's interesting, Jay, it's even more insidious than that, actually, and it's more cynical than that. The administration has decided that it wants to help fund a stalemate between the warring factions in Syria. They don't want either side to win, but they certainly don't want their side to lose. Mm-hmm. So what they're doing is that they're doubling the number of rebel fighters who they are giving instructions to in Jordan, and setting them loose in Syria, which of course causes more murder and more mayhem and more madness. But they're having just enough to keep the violence going, but not enough for them to actually win. So it really is the worst of all. And this is in the same week when the administration has praised the leadership in Syria for being so cooperative in the destruction of its chemical weapons. So if they're backing away from these things that we are upset about, then why is it that we continue to fund a rebel movement in Syria? Most of them are foreign, and over 75% of them now are jihadists. There are no moderates there, so why do we ramp up our assistance to them?
Good question. I guess somebody's making a lot of money with this, Daniel.
It certainly seems like bad faith.
I think, Richard Mayberry, who says that, this is going to go on, and he sees all this going on, that one of the ways you can make money, if you can stand, if your conscience will allow it, is to buy military, armament stocks. And anyway, I can't do it personally. It's not in my... I was brought up as a conscious rejecter. It's very difficult for me to be a part of that. But I want to thank you very much, Daniel. We're out of time, for enlightening us as to what's really going on in our foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jay.